Hey everyone, Leadership Now with Dan Pontefract. We're in conversation with Dr. Kostadin Kushlev. Kosta is an assistant professor and researcher at Georgetown University. He investigates how constant connectivity affects societal health and well-being. He's the principal investigator of the Digital Health and Happiness Lab, aka the Happy Tech Lab. Dr. Kushlev / Kosta, thanks so much for being here today. I've got a lot to dig in with you because I've spent a life watching the evolution of society's perhaps unhappiness grow and perhaps the correlation to technology, in particular smartphones. So we're going to get into all of that, but why don't we start here with sort of the opening salvo question. What is happiness? What's your definition at least? And sort of how are you using that definition perhaps, right, to kind of inform where your research takes you?
Yeah, so happiness is definitely a loaded term. And even we researchers who study happiness admit that happiness is something individual. People can define it for themselves. There's a lot of philosophers who wondered about what happiness is. But you're right that in order to study it scientifically, we need to define it. And so most commonly, the way we define happiness is more with the term subjective well-being, which at its basic, it has three components. So we have life satisfaction. So this is kind of a cognitive component of happiness. It has to do with how you evaluate your life. When I ask you, how satisfied are you with your life?
Okay.
And then there's more the emotional component or affective component of happiness. And so this is the frequency and intensity of positive emotions and negative emotions. And of course, negative emotions is, subtracted from your overall happiness score. But that's what we, so when you see results about, researchers found this and that about happiness, it might be any of those three components. Most frequently, it is life satisfaction. So a lot of the stuff on does money make you happy, is income related to happiness. Often it is this question about how you evaluate your life.
There have been other researchers, Seligman, Killingsworth, that have looked at happiness, and some argue that it's a state of flourishing, flow, or even, as the Greeks would say, eudaimonia. How do you relate sort of that notion of flourishing or flow or eudaimonia to some of your definitions of, a life satisfaction?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it turns out that, eudaimonia is a sort of a meaningful concept, and eudaimonia tends to be more about, a life of meaning, a life of where you, really reach your true potential, kind of going back to Maslow's pyramid, self-actualization. So, but as it turns out, we often think of those two things in opposition to each other, right? Do I want to live my life in a hedonic way and experience as much pleasure and positive emotions as possible? Or do I want to live my life in a meaningful and, self-actualized way? But it turns out that when you look at the data, those two things, eudaimonic well-being and hedonic well-being, are very highly correlated. And so when you think about it, for most of us, when we, what we do is, meaningful and important to us and so forth, that would translate into having more positive emotions and less negative emotions in our daily life and evaluating our lives more positively. So they're very highly correlated. Now, of course, there are, situations like, we can think of Viktor Frankl's account of, when he was in a concentration camp. Obviously, in that case, he wasn't experiencing a lot of hedonic well-being, not a lot of positive emotions, but had a high sense of meaning. So there are certainly those situations, but for most of us, those two components of well-being are very highly correlated. So this distinction isn't as stark as we might think.
Okay, well, thanks. That's really, really helpful. Now, the crux of your research, if I may, I think is about that exploration of how, constant connectivity to the interwebs, whether through smartphone, laptops, what have you, particularly smartphones, I think, is impacting our health, indeed our well-being. And so you've kind of been investigating over the years on sort of the harnessing of technology to improve actually health and well-being, and how technology might actually promote a positive behavioral change. So before I get into kind of specific questions about smartphones, et cetera, that again you've done some wonderful research with, help me understand first of all what you see really as sort of the baseline, i.e., this notion of, is technology harming or hurting, or helping? Is it all the above? And sort of set the stage, if you will, on that point.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it seems like the answer is definitely all of the above. A lot of the research on this topic has really kind of looked at net effects, meaning, looking at, the entirety of people's media consumption and how that relates to positive, negative emotions and so on. And so when you look at it this way, there are various teams of researchers. It's still being determined, but some of those researchers would tell you that, when you look at the net effects, it's about as harmful or as beneficial as eating potatoes or wearing glasses. So very, an effect that's close to zero. And so I would say, in some ways, however, for me, that's actually a very interesting finding, even though it's a non-finding, because if you think about how amazing these technologies are, right? So your smartphone allows you to, get information anytime you want, to connect with anybody you want, to stay in touch with friends and so on. And so the fact that, 10, 12 years later after the first iPhone, I guess it's 15 years now, time flies. But, I would expect that, society should be happier. We should be seeing these positive effects. So the fact that, what we actually see is an effect close to zero, when we look at the overall effect, should suggest to us that there are certain costs of these technologies that kind of compete with their benefits, and at the end of the day, we're not actually happier. And so what I've tried to do in my research is to try to document some of those situations in which technology can actually hurt our well-being, so that we can design the technology in a way that avoids those situations, and individuals can also think about their own technology use to improve their well-being without incurring the costs.
And Costa, some of the research that you get into is downright fascinating for, I guess, a technology behaviorist like me, who's been in organizations right through from the evolution of Napster to where we are today with various social medias and the metaverse. So what I found fascinating about some of your research was the smartphone influence of well-being. And you don't necessarily suggest influence is only negative, but that there's three hypotheses. So let me explain to the audience what I'm getting at, and then maybe you can fill in the commentary here. So you believe through your research that the influence of well-being through the smartphone actually creates three kind of hypotheses. So there's the displacement hypothesis, if I get this right. And displacement hypothesis is that the smartphone is actually replacing other activities that people might otherwise be doing if they didn't have that in their pocket. The second hypothesis is interference hypothesis, where it's actually getting in the way of you and your activities, whether they're concurrent or in the moment or what have you. And then the third hypothesis, again, if I get this right, is I think complementary hypothesis, where in essence, you're affording access to information and activities that's unavailable, meaning this is a good thing. So take us through the three hypotheses, if you will, and help us as the listener understand where you're getting at with this research and what we might do with it.
Sure. Yeah. So the displacement hypothesis has been around for a while. This is certainly not something that I have invented. So if we think about back in the day, Putnam's research and books on television and how that's undermining social capital. So, it essentially is the displacement hypothesis. So Putnam's argument was that with more and more people getting TVs in their home back in the 50s and 60s, activities such as community bowling and so on that got people together in person was declining, and so he argued that undermines social capital. So of course, fast forward to today. It's the same thing. So we spend a certain amount of time on our phones. I challenge your listeners and viewers to check their screen time and be amazed at how many hours a day. My screen time certainly isn't very low. It runs certainly in the 3 to 4 hour range a day. And so the question is, well, what would you have done with these 3 or 4 hours a day if you weren't on your phone, right? And so, that the answer might be, well, I would have exercised more, I would have spent more time with friends, I would have gone to a bowling alley, whatever the case might be. This is time that, we spend on our phone. Another big one, I should say, is sleep. We know Americans don't sleep enough, and I'm assuming some of those 3 hours are right before bed or in the morning. And so that's the displacement hypothesis. So with the interference hypothesis, this gets us more closely to this, the omnipresence of technology that has really, become, something different qualitatively with everybody having a smartphone now, right? So now, unlike a laptop or a desktop computer, we're using this technology while we're doing other activities, right? So maybe it's while we're exercising, maybe while it is while we are having dinner with friends and family, and so on. And so a lot of my research on smartphone has focused on this interference hypothesis. And looking at what happens when we use our phones when we're spending time with others. Now, from the research on happiness, we know that one of the biggest predictors of happiness is actually spending time with others, and especially friends and family. And so when when our attention is directed to our phones rather than our friends and family, we lose some of those benefits. And, in my research, we see this over and over again. We see it, for example, parents spending time with their children are, derive less sense of a meaning when they're spent more time on their phone. We've seen, friends and family having dinner at a restaurant, enjoy the experience less when they are using their phones or even just having them on the table. And anyway, the list goes on. The final hypothesis is the complementarity hypothesis. So the idea here is that, yes, so these devices provide lots of information, entertainment that might not otherwise be available. And so one study that we did with this hypothesis was to basically get students, young people, to try to find a building at the University of British Columbia campus, which is a pretty large campus. So we found buildings that they didn't know where they were and told them, go find them. And then we randomly assigned people to either, have their phones on them or not. And we didn't tell them to use their phones or anything like this. But of course, everybody who had their phones on them used their phones to find the building. They got to the building faster, and they were in a better mood when they got to the building. The people who didn't have their phones on them still found the building, but they also, took a little bit longer time. And so overall, if we think of happiness as positive emotions, the phones in this case were definitely useful in making people, happier. However, we also found that the people who couldn't rely on their phones had to mostly rely on other people. So they asked other people, they talked to more people. And then at the end of the search, they actually felt the greatest sense of social connectedness. So when they did not have their phones. And so this kind of tells you that, these hypotheses, even though complementarity kind of sounds positive, even when we are, overall the net benefits are positive, there might still be costs even to those positive aspects of technology.
Well, that actually segues nicely to another question I wanted to ask you about some more research that you did. And that was about an experiment I believe you did with smartphones and notifications. And so I'll set it up and please provide the commentary analysis. So if I understand it right, you kind of set up your trial-based audience with notifications where notifications came as usual, like all the time. Then there was a cohort of individuals in the research group where you batched the notifications, I think 3 times a day. And then you had another group that had no notifications. And so if I understand correctly, you were basically assessing the smartphone technology and almost like, the Las Vegas slot machine pull of notification and the adrenaline and the dopamine hits that come with it, and seeing where people would necessarily, I guess, relate to, or what emotion they might emit. So if I got that right, tell me yes or no, but also fill in the blanks as to what you discovered.
Sure, yeah. So, this is exactly right. So we randomly assigned people to one of those 3 conditions. We actually had a 4th condition as well, where we batched the notifications once every hour.
Okay.
But interestingly, we didn't make much of that condition because we actually found no difference between once an hour and business as usual conditions, so as they come. And so it seemed like batching once an hour is a little bit too frequent to see any effects. But when the batching was 3 times a day, so people basically, they got their notifications in 3 daily batches. So whatever notifications came before that time of day, they were all delivered at the same time. And so these people, this group of people felt less stressed, they had a better mood, and all of these effects were explained by improvements in their attention. So they felt like they were more attentive to whatever they were doing, and that explained why they felt better, less stressed, and so on. And so I think this study basically shows that, essentially is I guess, we don't like to use the word proof in scientific
of course
discourse, but it at least suggests that the interference hypothesis might, be true. And so, because when people are distracted by notifications as they come in, they get, that interferes with their other activities throughout the day, and that's not good for happiness or stress. Now, interestingly, we also found that, delivering no notifications, so in that condition, people actually experienced less benefits. And we think the reason why that might be is that when you don't get any of your notifications, well, then your mind is starting to, distract itself. You're kind of wondering, what are you missing out on? And we did actually find that the people who didn't have any notifications throughout the day had a high level of, FOMO, fear of missing out. And so they didn't experience the same benefits in terms of stress and so on. And so it, it's this, I really love this study because it shows that we don't want to be throwing the baby with the bathwater, right? We want to find the golden mean where we are not distracted all the time and we can focus on things that matter, but we also, don't want to be completely disconnected and wonder what we're missing out on.
So do you think then, as a consequence, like the high-tech companies, in particular Apple and Google, and Samsung maybe are listening to research like yours with, new inventions like do not disturb times that you can set up on your phone so that you can have some focus time to yourself and not worry about the slot machine draw of the dopamine hit and the new red flag that you get, or the red check mark that someone has liked your Instagram post or what have you. Like, do you see high tech waking up to this problem?
I do. I do see, a lot of new, features. So, for example, the latest version of the iOS system on the iPhone actually does have this batching thing integrated, and it invites you to set it up when you open your new iPhone, and it's basically, it's very similar to what we did in that study. Essentially, it tells you, how many times a day. I think that it's called notification summary or something like that. It's not called batching, but you can actually tell it what apps you want to get notifications as they come in, and what apps you want to be included in the notification summary. You can decide how many times a day you want a notification summary. And so now, the question of, whether Apple had seen that paper of ours about batching, I don't know. I think part of, what's going on too is that even without the research, people are already aware that, we're way too distracted by technology, right? Like, it's almost like you don't need to read a paper to know this in your personal experience. And I think a lot of these, tech people being surrounded by tech are probably, more aware than anybody else that that can be a problem. So anyway, so I don't know if my research has made any difference, but yes, that new feature on the iOS is, exactly what we did in our study. So I guess it's encouraging.
Yeah, it is indeed, and good on you. Now, I want to end with a segment really focus on the pandemic and face-to-face interactions, because again, a good deal of your research, which is profound, really focuses on the subtle kind of social cost, if you will, of that constant smartphone checking, that constant technology draw, and that you propose in essence, the constant connection is actually undercutting the emotional benefits of face-to-face social interactions. And I think you detail kind of 2 or 3 different ways in which this is undercutting. So first, before we get to the pandemic type of dialogue, tell us a bit about, again, your analysis and synthesis, right, of those social costs and what, somewhat obviously we have opportunity costs that go with it.
Yeah, so exactly. The idea is that the more we have going on without our smartphones, the more we have to lose in terms of happiness. And so when we use our phones while, I don't know, we are at a festival or something, surrounded by people, we might miss out on social interactions and so on. When we are stuck at home because of a pandemic, then the theory is that we should see more of the benefits of these technologies and less of the cost, because again, they have less to interfere with. There's some recent research, not from my lab, but looking at this precise question during the pandemic, and they did actually find that the time people spent on online socializing with others was positively related to well-being when social distancing was at its highest level during the pandemic. When social distancing was less high, we know there was quite a lot of variation in the past 2 years. Spending more time online was actually unrelated to well-being. And so the idea here is that, again, when we have an opportunity to actually be with others and spend time with others, then spending time talking with people online might actually not produce higher benefits to well-being because we are missing out on, something that could make us even happier, which is in-person social interactions.
And so where are we, I guess, today? So we're recording this, in the first quarter of 2022, and, we're hopefully ending or entering into a, if not post-pandemic, endemic world. We're slowly getting back to some normalcy. Offices are reopening. What have we gleaned over the last 2 years in your research of the pandemic when it relates to what should we be looking forward to, or maybe even addressing, in our lives, perhaps even in our organizations, when it comes to, your line of work and your focus on the research?
Sure, yes. Well, I think what we have learned is certainly that in-person is better than virtual in general. But we have also learned that this hybrid model, where we sometimes can join virtually, and join a meeting virtually via Zoom or whatever, can actually be quite useful. And so, I think the research is still happening as we speak on this topic. But I think in general, the research on the hybrid workplace, even before the pandemic, suggests that hybrid can be, hybrid meaning, you go to work some days, you work from home some days, can actually be the best of both worlds. Again, not throwing the baby with the bathwater, but and so I think the fact that we have really learned how to use these technologies, Zoom for work especially, can be really beneficial. And so I wouldn't, if I were, a company or an employer, I wouldn't, necessarily try to go back to, requiring employees to be at work every day. But I think it is also clear that working entirely from home, especially in the long term, is probably not a good solution. It might be more convenient in the shorter term, but in the long term, there's other things like, sense of belonging. We've all heard about Zoom fatigue, and there's, research suggesting that it is real. But I think part of the, reason why, Zoom fatigue might be something that has happened is that we are, in the real world, in person, we can, quickly, chat with somebody and ask them a quick question. When we're all remote, everything needs to be a whole meeting. And then the default is, half an hour, and so we schedule all these meetings. So I feel like, Zoom and working from home has made meetings, multiplied, right? And so I think being able to see your colleagues from time to time is good, but it doesn't necessarily need to be every day.
Right. I love it. You had me at hello, Costa. I totally agree. So final question, and we'll let you go. You've been so generous with your time. What are your tips or techniques, or, your must-haves or must-dos for individuals as they, I guess, become better at using their phone such that they enter into a state of better well-being for themselves?
Sure. So I would say, research is me-search is something that researchers sometimes say, meaning that we often research things that are relevant to our own lives. And so I would definitely say that I started researching smartphones because I started, being very distracted by my smartphone. And so I wondered what the actual effects are on others. And so, and so I would say, people are often, because of my research, are often like super self-conscious about using their smartphones around me. And so I just want to assure everybody that I'm not judging anybody, and I actually use my phone quite a lot, not always in the most productive ways, which is why I study this. But one thing that I do is I tend to keep my phone on silent the majority of the time. And so, I do use the batching and summary, but, obviously not for all apps. So that does allow me to kind of take a little bit control over my attention from my smartphone. And so, I look at it frequently enough, trust me. So there's no chance that I'll actually miss something really important just by keeping it on silent. And so I think if you're like me, keeping your phone on silent can be a good step to reclaim some of your attention. Another thing, we know that from some of my research, even asking participants to have their phones on the table without telling them to use it actually undermines enjoyment. And so I would say, if you want to focus on the people around you, keep your phone in your pocket or in your bag or whatever. So those are two easy, practical things to do.
I love it. We must be cut from the same cloth, because I long ago, years ago, turned off all notifications, phone on silent, except for my wife, who has a special vibration for me, and my 3 teenagers, who also get a special vibration. Everything else I could care less about. And I am in charge of when I'm going to, draw down on the slot machine to see if someone liked my post on Instagram. Dr. Kushlev, this has been an honor. Thanks so much for this. Where can people find out more about you?
Well, they can go to my website, which is Kushlev, KUSHLEV.com. And they can find me on Google. It's a pretty unique last name, so Google away.
Well, we're glad, as a British Columbian, you are a PhD degree owner from the University of British Columbia. Well done. Thanks for this today, and best of luck with the rest of your research.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Dan.